Hi, everyone. I hope you're having a great week so far. So this is chapter 11. This is a fun chapter. It's all about caffeine, so very relevant to many people. So we're going to go through this chapter just like we've done with some of our other chapters, talk about some of the history, some of the different factors of how this drug is sort of been perpetuated throughout our lives and into our society. We'll talk about the different specific aspects of the drug, its chemical properties, and how it affects our body. And things like that, and kind of end where we talk about maybe some pros and cons of how we can use and interact with this drug in our daily lives. All right, so now we're going to talk about chapter 11, caffeine. So when we talk about caffeine, obviously caffeine is a drug that is used by many people. It is the number one drug used worldwide and is ingested by many, many people. It does still have some dependence, some addictive properties, but generally it doesn't interfere much with normal functioning, though there is evidence that it is possible that it can. So we're talking about caffeine. We're going to go through a few things. We're going to talk first about coffee specifically. So we're going to break this down a little bit differently. We're going to start off by talking about coffee. We'll go through the history and the different types of coffee that exist. Then we'll talk about tea and talk about, again, the history and types of tea and how that kind of has progressed throughout time. And then we'll talk about chocolate and some other sources of caffeine that we have today as well. We can see some examples in that image on the right. Then we'll talk about the pharmacology of caffeine, how that kind of works in our body. We'll talk about behavioral effects, and then finally some causes for concern here when talking about caffeine. All right, so let's go ahead and start off by talking about coffee. And so when we talk about coffee, we're going to break this down and talk just a little bit about the history of coffee. It's a little bit interesting how this sort of developed, and both coffee and tea have some interesting legend backstories, I should say, with both of them being some interesting stories. So let's start off actually with the legend of coffee. So here we have the idea that this came from a guy named Kaldi, which was an Ethiopian goat herder. And the idea or the story here was that he and his goats would eat these coffee berries and they would dance around and have these stimulating effects of coffee. Now, again, this is just the urban legend of where coffee came from. But it's a fun story to kind of think about how we got there. And then because of him and his goats, that story, that idea spread to different places. And when we see the actual history of coffee that we know, we see its early use at about the 1400s here in Egypt and other Arabic countries. Then from there, the 1500s, we see it spread throughout the Middle East. And then finally, not until about the 1600s, do we see it start to appear more in Europe. And with that appearance in Europe, we see the use and the more general acceptance of coffee kind of take place in a few different ways. So one of the ways was what are known as penny universities. Think of this as kind of like a coffee house, right? Where people would come and they would pay small portions or pennies and they would drink coffee and they would listen and learn from different literary or political figures of the period. So again, they called these penny universities, one of the early forms of what we think of probably as coffee houses where people would come and drink coffee. Interestingly enough, around 1674, women in England actually proposed this first sort of petition against coffee. It was called the Women's Petition Against Coffee. And part of the reason that they did this was on the grounds that it made men impotent, right? So they actually came together and produced this petition to, stop the use of coffee because of this problem. Kind of an interesting story to go along with this. We saw increased uses of coffee throughout history for different reasons. Number one, some different British tea taxes, when they would tax tea, would result in an increase of the use of coffee. And we'll talk about some of those tea taxes as we get into the tea side of things. But the increased tea tax would just drive people over to use more coffee. Also, interestingly enough, prohibition in the US, when that was taking place, people actually saw an increase in coffee consumption as well. And so we actually found was that pretty much that the height of coffee consumption, at least here in the US, was around 1946, where we saw the highest ingestion of coffee as a means of getting caffeine. Interestingly, now after that, after the 1946, we saw soft drinks, energy drinks, things like that replacing coffee as ways to get caffeine. So like I said, 1946 was the height of the consumption here of coffee specifically. All right, so let's talk about some different types of coffee and how different coffees are made. Really, coffee kind of breaks down into two different species. We have the Caffea arabica, which tends to have a more mild flavor. It takes longer to develop and grow after being planted, and often requires more of a tropical climate to grow in. Then we have Caffea robusta, which has a stronger, more bitter flavor, and also a higher caffeine content. So it really just kind of depends, but both of these species are forms of coffee that we can kind of break things down into each of them. Then, of course, we have decaffeinated coffee. So some interesting things with decaf coffee here is that they basically remove the caffeine from the coffee bean. This is most common in the US. We'll actually soak the beans, some kind of solvent, which removes the caffeine from them. People have, potentially raised concerns about this solvent causing issues or leaving residue on the coffee, but generally speaking, not a concern that we really have. And the caffeine that is taken, that extracted from those coffee beans, actually then gets reused and put into other forms of caffeinated beverages like soft drinks or energy drinks or things like that. So again, decaffeinated coffee extracts the caffeine from those coffee beans before the coffee's made, and then that caffeine gets used in other ways. Some different varieties of coffee we have. There's quite a large variety of coffee, right? So we have like Colombian coffee, French roast, decaf, flavored coffees, instant coffee, cold brew coffee. There's so many different types of coffee and so many different ways that it is produced and made that, just know that there are a lot of different types of coffee, right? We can't go through every single one of them and talk about them, but they're produced in different ways, have different caffeine content and different flavors to them. And actually, interesting, fun statistic here that the types of coffee generally sold went from about 200 different types in 1989 to about 35,000 types in 2019. So again, the types of coffee is just off the charts here. Okay, so let's shift now to tea, and we'll talk a little bit about tea and the history here that we have of tea. So tea's legend story is even more wild than the coffee. Coffee was just a guy and some goats, dancing around having some coffee beans. The legend here with tea actually comes from a guy named Dharma, who was actually the founder of Zen Buddhism. And the idea here was that he cut off his eyelids so that he could stay awake while he was meditating. And where his eyelids fell onto the ground, a plant grew from those eyelids. And the leaves from that plant could then be plucked and harvested to give the drinker the feeling of alertness and to keep them awake. So kind of a wild story here, but kind of an interesting one, at least if you are interested in the history or the legend of tea. But the origins of this can be traced back again to China, again, where we see sort of this Buddhist founder of Dharma. So when we talk about some of its first actual uses or medical uses, we see this around AD 350. We start to see again that early medical use being documented. About 780, we see sort of this non-medical use that was documented, just sort of the enjoyment of tea. Then in about 1610 was when tea first came into Europe. So this was brought over into Europe by the Dutch, and they helped bring over some of this tea from China into the European region. This also later on produced what was known as the English East India Company. So this helped basically, produce, move, and import different types of tea. And what happened was in 1669, the British banned the import of Dutch tea. So because of that, this East English India Company became the monopoly for importing teas. So basically, the Dutch brought it over. England developed their own mechanism, then banned the use of Dutch so that they had control over the import of tea. And this was one of the reasons too, some of the benefits or the profits made from this helped switch English consumers of caffeine, you could say, more over to tea from coffee. Of course, we have to talk about the American Revolution and the Boston Tea Party when looking at the history of tea, right? This was a huge fact, the whole idea of taxation without representation, where taxes from the British were high on tea products. And so, of course, a group in Boston threw this tea off of the ships to protest this taxation. And so some of the effects of this, interestingly enough, some of the effects were that the smuggling of tea increased, right? So people still wanted their tea. They just didn't want to pay taxes on it, of course. And this is also one of the reasons why we see this distinction between coffee and tea in the US versus in Great Britain. So we see more of the love of tea over in England and Britain, and more coffee use here in the US. And part of the reason for that is because over in Britain, people to kind of, stand against this, that if you drank tea, you were loyal to the crown. You were loyal to that British Empire that was responsible for taxing the US. So it created this sort of social construct on tea as well. All right, let's talk about some different types of tea here. So when we're talking about the types of tea, let's first talk about how tea is produced, because this matters for the different types of tea. So tea is produced by plucking the leaves off of these plants. Then the leaves get dried, and then they get sort of rolled up and crushed and placed in a cool, damp place to be either fermented or oxidized. So either fermentation or oxidation takes place to change the chemical property of the leaves into different types of tea. And so the different types of tea we have are things like black tea, which involves the leaves becoming fully oxidized. It has higher concentrations of caffeine normally than some of these other forms. Then we have green tea, which is actually where the leaves are not oxidized. So it's a different sort of process. They stop that process at different points for these different types of tea. And green tea has become more popular recently, especially with different, herbal diets and trends and things like that. Green tea has become more popular, again, recently. Then we have what's known as oolong tea. So oolong kind of sits somewhere in between black and green tea, where it has partially oxidized leaves, tends to have a greenish brown color, and again, has about somewhere in the middle of the amount of caffeine. Black tea has the most caffeine, green tea has the least caffeine, oolong tea sits somewhere in between. We also have iced tea, right? So this is especially popular in some of the southern regions of the US. It actually accounts for about 85% of all tea consumed in the US. So here we love our iced tea. That's really where we consume most of our tea. We also have flavored teas, right? Adding different mints, spices, or even fruit flavors into teas. And then we have just general herbal teas, which contain other flowers or flavoring, but sometimes no actual tea is present in these. So lots of different types of tea. Again, just like coffee, there's a lot of ways that tea is consumed, flavored, and arranged. But unlike coffee, tea has distinct types, like we said, black, green, oolong, based on the actual, fermentation and production process that is going on, from extracting it from the plant to stopping that process and sending to consumers. All right, let's talk about some other sources of caffeine now. So specifically, we've got chocolate is one that people think of, and then we'll talk about some others as well. So chocolate is interesting because it actually doesn't have very much caffeine in it. We'll talk about that as we go. But chocolate actually comes from the Aztec culture, where they would, have this this harvest of what they called of theobroma, which translates into food of the gods. And the legend here is that this cacao tree was a gift to humans for paradise from the Aztec god Quetzalcoatl. And this is the idea that, again, it was given to us from the gods. About 1847 was the first invention of chocolate bars. And then a little bit later in 1876, milk chocolate was actually invented by the Swiss. Now, what's interesting about chocolate is that it contains a different xanthine content than some of these other forms. So we talked about coffee, we talked about tea, and the main xanthine component in those is caffeine. The main xanthine component in chocolate is a chemical called theobromine. Now, this has similar effects to caffeine, but has some differences as well. So it's less potent and has less effects on the central nervous system specifically. So when we talk about this, when we talk about chocolate, the average cup of hot chocolate, that contains about 200 milligrams of theobromine, but only about 4-ish milligrams of caffeine. So actually, when we think of hot chocolate, if we think about it sort of having those stimulating effects like caffeine, it's really not coming from the caffeine, it's coming from the theobromine, which has a slightly different effect. Fun story here, I'll tell this. Theobromine has a slower absorption into the body, and it stays in your body a little bit longer than caffeine does. So I tell the story that I, one afternoon consumed an entire chocolate bunny from Easter. And that is what caused me to not sleep basically the entire night. And so that was because of that theobromine and its, again, similar effects, but it takes longer for your body to digest and to see that peak level from, but it also takes, compared to caffeine, it stays in your body longer and has a longer half-life of that point of breaking down. We also see caffeine consumed through soft drinks, of course. So Coca-Cola being a big one, developed as the nerve tonic from the late 1800s, has a lot of different ingredients as this, including different caramel and fruit flavors, but caffeine is a big component. And of course, early on, Coca-Cola also contained small amounts of cocaine, which now, of course, that is not a component of it anymore. We also have energy drinks, right? So different types of energy drinks contain different amounts of caffeine. Some of them, one of actually the lower amount of caffeine ones is Red Bull, one of the more commonly known ones. Red Bull actually contains typically even less caffeine than a cup of coffee, but it's mostly what you're consuming in it. It just doesn't have a lot of other things. But some of these other energy drinks can actually have 2 to 3 times as much caffeine as a cup of coffee does. We should, I think, see here in a minute a diagram that kind of depicts some of those differences between levels of caffeine. Then we also have over-the-counter drugs as well. So some examples of these include a drug called Vivarium. These are drugs that, again, contain caffeine in just a different way of administering it without having to drink something to get it into your body. Now, interestingly enough, the average caffeine intake of an American is about 200 milligrams a day. And you can see how much is in each of these different drinks. Again, going from decaf coffee with only about 3 milligrams of caffeine, almost nothing. They just can't get it all out. Up to things like green tea, which has about 20, a can of Coca-Cola, about 40, black brewed tea, you see about 45. Again, Red Bull, about 80. and then brewed coffee sitting up at about 95. So you see what I like to think of as sort of the main, the main things here. You have a brewed cup of coffee as your standard. About half of that you get from a cup of brewed black tea, and about half of that you get from a cup of green tea. So when you look at kind of this on a spectrum, you get an idea of how that caffeine is distributed. Again, we have energy drinks that go off the chart here, having upwards of 200 to even 300 milligrams of caffeine in each drink. So those do increase and get quite ridiculous in the amount of caffeine that they contain. So don't treat every energy drink the same. Definitely look to see how much caffeine is in it. And now you have a reference point based on these different types of drinks. All right, now let's talk about the pharmacology of caffeine specifically and how this kind of breaks up into your body. So I said before, the main kind of chemical here are what are known as xanthines. So this is caffeine, theophylline, and theobromine, like we said in chocolate. But these are the different components or the chemicals basically that we look at when we're talking about this. When we think about the time course of caffeine and how it is ingested into the body, it's pretty rapid when we take it orally, right? So it tends to be ingested not only through our digestive system, but also through the process of going through it. So we see peak blood levels of caffeine roughly about 30 minutes after we intake that drink of caffeine. And the half-life in people is about 3 hours. So again, that's when we see 50% of the caffeine that's left in our body after about 3 hours. Again, this contrasts things like theobromine, which have a peak about 2 to 3 hours after ingesting it, and a half-life of upwards of 7 or more hours. When we talk about dependence and addiction of caffeine, caffeine definitely does have reinforcing properties as well. It has some positive ones like stimulating effects, but also some negative ones as well that we get when we remove that caffeine from us. So we have issues when undergoing withdrawal. Some of the most common withdrawal symptoms include headaches, increased fatigue, decreased sense of vigor, things like that. But interestingly enough, the DSM-5 actually doesn't list caffeine under any substance use disorders. So while there are still some effects here, they are not enough to actually be listed or classified as a substance use disorder. When we talk about the mechanism of action here, we see xanthines really working on the adenosine neurotransmitter. Adenosine is really interesting because it is both a neurotransmitter and also one of the components of DNA. So it works in different ways depending on how it's present or what it's doing in the body. But when functioning as a neurotransmitter, adenosine is an inhibitory neurotransmitter, kind of like GABA, where it helps to again inhibit or reduce the activation of different areas. And so what xanthines, like caffeine, do is they block those receptors for adenosine. So adenosine can't get in and reduce or subside or calm the system. And so by effect, we have a more alert system. So again, caffeine is blocking those adenosine receptors, not allowing it to calm the system down. We also have some physiological effects here. Of course, it's just generally a stimulant when we look at it from the central nervous system as well as skeletal muscular system. It can cause sleep disturbances, elevate mood. It also constricts blood vessels in the brain, which is one of the reasons that may explain why caffeine can be used to reduce migraine headaches, because again, it's restricting those blood vessels in the brain, maybe helping alleviate some of that pressure or those issues with migraines. All right, let's talk about some behavioral effects here of caffeine. Of course, it's a stimulant, so you get those stimulating effects, right? It can offset fatigue. It can prolong the amount of time someone can perform physically exhausting work, different things like that. It can also be used as a headache treatment, right? We just talked about that. It can help relieve both migraine and tension headaches sort of by working on that constriction of those blood vessels. Interestingly enough, it can actually be used as a hyperactivity treatment, right? So if you recall from one of our earlier lectures, we talked briefly about how ADHD symptoms are caused by a part of the brain that helps regulate those hyperactivity components not functioning quite to the level it needs to. So rather than almost counterintuitively wanting to calm that down, you want to increase the activity of that part of the brain so that it can better control and regulate other regions. And so caffeine has been shown to potentially help alleviate some of these hyperactivity effects. And then when we talk about the effect of, quote, sobering up, right? Does it actually help people sober up from the effects of alcohol and things like that? So while, general answer is no, it really doesn't. So it doesn't lower any of the blood alcohol concentration. There's really little evidence that'll help anybody sober up. Maybe it increases arousal a little bit, but even if that arousal is increased, the person is still just as impaired as they were, even if they might not think that they are to the same degree. All right. And lastly, we'll end here just talking about some causes for concern of caffeine. And overall, right, there's really no clear evidence that, with moderate consumption, there's any harm with consuming caffeine. So it is one of the safer drugs in that regard. It doesn't it hasn't been linked to any forms of cancer that we know of. So that is a benefit here as well. However, we do see some potential effects with reproductive ability, specifically at really high consumption of caffeine can reduce fertility. We can have issues with heart disease. So it's kind of a two-front here. So high intake of caffeine can actually increase the risk of heart attacks, specifically with people with that as a risk factor. However, small amounts of caffeine can actually lower that risk. So finding the right amount is a good thing, but again, going too far can increase that risk. And so then lastly, we have here what's called caffeineism, or basically the excessive use of caffeine, which is really something nobody does. We're talking extreme here. This is, how much it would take to actually kill someone by ingesting caffeine. And so when we see this, toxicity is generally pretty low, right? It would take about 100 cups of coffee to kill somebody. And so not something we really see happen. If it does, though, we do see some unpleasant symptoms at lower levels of this, maybe nervousness, irritability, muscle twitching, insomnia, things like that. So there are still some negative effects, especially when we ingest caffeine to an increased degree, but it's unlikely for us to hit that lethal dose. All right, and that wraps up chapter 11. Next week, we're actually going to skip to chapter 13, looking at a bit of a more serious drug, looking at some opioids and how those, again, kind of are prevalent in society and some of the problems and causes for concern for those. So next week, again, that's opioids. We're skipping to chapter 13.